Welcome to Zero Knowledge. I'm your host, Anna Rose. In this podcast, we will be exploring the latest in zero-knowledge research and the decentralized web, as well as new paradigms that promise to change the way we interact and transact online. This week, we dive back into the past with the third episode in our series on zero-knowledge systems, the legendary company from the late 90s that shares the name with this podcast. In this episode, I have the chance to interview one of the original founders of zero-knowledge systems, Austin Hill. We discuss how he first got involved in tech in the early 90s, the journey to build zero-knowledge systems, and what the tech scene in Montreal and across Canada was really like during that era. We cover everything from raising money in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom to the ambitious vision for the company, the dynamic team that was put together, and the mission of providing a future of privacy and sovereignty, which was at the heart of their original product, Freedom. The company emerged at the start as a media darling, a shining example of Canadian tech potential. But during the dot-com bust, it was forced to rethink its strategy, eventually reducing its ambition and finding product-market fit as a B2B business. Austin shares his personal journey after zero-knowledge systems, including how he discovered Bitcoin, how he and some of the other zero-knowledge systems alumni co-founded Blockstream, and how they navigated the opportunities and challenges of building a business around a revolutionary open-source technology. We wrap up with him sharing his new project, Machine Phase Systems, and the field of technology that's getting him excited today. This conversation provides an amazing snapshot of a very different time in tech, when the dream of a private internet free from surveillance and censorship seemed within reach, but how market forces, circumstances, and consumer preferences shifted the internet's trajectory in another direction. Before you listen to this episode, you may want to hear the other two episodes in the series. I'll add the link in the show notes. In the first one, I talk more about my own personal connection to the Zero Knowledge Systems company. So again, I do recommend you listen to that before you listen to this one. Now, before we kick off, I do want to just let you know about the ZK Summit. ZK Summit 13 is coming up. It's happening on May 12th in Toronto. This is the second time we bring the ZK Summit to North America, the first being all the way back in 2019 when we did one in San Francisco. If you've never been to a ZK Summit, I definitely recommend checking it out. This is the spot to find out about the latest research, the newest applications, to find out who are the most important players in ZK today. It's also a wonderful way to get to know sort of the larger ZK community. The application to attend is now open. Links, as always, are in the show notes, and I hope to see you there. Now, here is my interview with Austin. Today, I'm here with Austin Hill. Austin is one of the founders of the Zero Knowledge Systems company we've been talking about, as well as one of the co-founders of Blockstream. Welcome to the show, Austin.
Thanks, Anna. Very nice to be here.
I'm pretty excited to have you on the show to talk about zero knowledge systems in even more detail than we've already covered it. I do want to recommend to listeners that if they haven't yet, they should listen to the short episode I recorded where I discussed my unexpected connection to the Zero Knowledge Systems company. I'll link to this in the show notes. It's only 15 minutes, but I do recommend listening to that episode before this one. We also recorded an episode with one of the employees of Zero Knowledge Systems, Jonathan, and I'll add that to the show notes as well. So Austin, I'd really love to hear about Zero Knowledge Systems, but I think before we do that, I want to kind of understand why you even wanted to work on these topics. What was the beginning point that inspired you towards this?
So I grew up in Canada. I was very much a kind of tech geek, hacker. I got my first modem when I was 7 or 8 years old. I was running a bulletin board by the time I was 10. Just having friends dial in and, acting like I was a lot older than I was on the message boards. Nice. And then kind of got exposed to the internet just through most of us. To get access to the internet, you had to hack a local university because there were no commercial internet accounts. And so exploring the internet fascinated me. And through that and reading early articles in 2600, Frack, which were like hacker e-zines and magazines, I started being exposed to the idea of civil liberties online. And it really started after the FBI had done an operation called Operation Sun Devil in 1994, where they rounded up a whole bunch of hackers and treated them essentially like terrorists when they were mostly teenagers exploring the computer world, when the rules and laws were still somewhat unknown. And that's what led to the creation of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, actually. So John Perry Barlow, who wrote the Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace, and Mitch Kapor and John Gilmore, heroes of kind of the computer freedom movement, started saying we need to write civil liberties online. And so combination with sci-fi reading, I kind of read all the cypherpunk stuff and the cyberpunk. I had started getting exposed to this. And so when PGP first came out, I was on the front lines. I was on the cypherpunk mailing lists. But it was a hobby of mine. And I had started a company with my brother, and our father was an investor, which became one of the largest internet providers in Canada.
I wondered a bit about this. Like, this sounds like pretty vanilla technology company, but why this?
Well, I moved to Montreal. And so in 1994, I moved to Montreal. You could barely get an internet account. There still wasn't a commercial internet. The French government in Quebec had announced that they were going to provide free internet for the entire province, but translated entirely into French because there were only 2,000 websites. So they thought they could translate the entire web and provide free access to everyone.
Wow.
So no one was putting money into internet providers. And I looked at their plan. I was like, this is stupid. This will never work. I'm just going to launch an internet provider. And so over the course of the next few years, we became one of the largest operating across Canada. We had 80,000 dial-up subscribers, and we sold the company. And so once I sold that, I had a bit of money. I was still very young in my 20s. And right away, I started thinking, like, with my partners, what do we want to do next?
Yeah.
And I was really obsessed with this idea that what if we could take some of the early tools that the cypherpunks were talking about? And they were talking about the social implications, the math, but it was still, most of these tools had not been built yet, like a mixed network to anonymize your online traffic, electronic cash system, a privacy tool that could allow you to have a different pseudonym, an email address that wasn't linked to your actual identity, because one of the most famous remailers that would do this got shut down by the Church of Scientology because they were forced to reveal who was behind a pseudonym.
But this is more recently, right?
No, this was all in the 1990s.
That was in the 90s. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Early 1993, 94 was a non.penet.fi, which was shut down by the Church of Scientology. So I was well versed in these issues, and I'd been more of a lurker, but observing all these conversations on the cypherpunk list while I was running my internet provider. And so afterwards, I kind of got together with my partners and wrote up an initial idea for what became Zero Knowledge and Freedom, which was the founding idea was kind of if we had online identities that were separate from our real identities. So pseudonymous, totally separate identities, combined with anonymous networking like Tor, where we didn't have to reveal our IP address and we were protected from cookies and being monitored, and electronic cash to pay for things, then we could build a totally private internet where surveillance capitalism wasn't at the heart of it. And that was really the founding vision. We said the same way Netscape made browsing the net easy, we need to make adopting cryptography that easy.
Were these ideas super well known in the cypherpunk world, or was that combination kind of novel?
In the cypherpunk community, which was a small community, but very influential, yes, these things were discussed all the time.
Okay.
They drew ideas from sci-fi, Werner Vinge, True Names, and, in the realm of cyberspace, which was a famous book in the cypherpunk lore. The design of systems like anonymous remailers, some early code prototypes. I mean, that's where Adam Back had done his Hashcash implementation, which was using cryptography to solve spam. And they were discussing how can you adopt this. And there was a lot of discussion around patents, because patents at the time were one of the biggest blocking points, because most of the encryption libraries were all based off RSA's encryption.
Yes.
Or they were based on which you had to have a license and was restricted from export, or they were based off some other, open source toolkits. And all the electronic cash patents were tied up by David Shom. So there were a lot of discussion and awareness, but in general society, people were still figuring out, can I trust to put my credit card online?
Yeah.
No one had any understanding of crypto.
Interesting. The year that we're talking about when you started to have the idea for zero knowledge systems, is that 96, 90? When is that?
It was 97. It was
97.
1997. We sold the company kind of end of 96, 97. We spent a couple months coming up with the plan, researching.
Mm-hmm.
I dove really, really deep into crypto and understanding the algorithms and kind of studying at a deeper level how the protocols work. And then, we put in a bunch of our own money and said, okay, we'll hire a team to start, and then we'll raise some venture capital.
The work you had done on the ISP, do you think that was there any connection there? Had you seen something in that work that felt like, the lack of privacy was really dangerous for people? Like, was there anything that had sort of, that you were taking along with you, or was it kind of a brand new project?
It was pretty much a brand new project. Obviously, we were immersed in everything that was the internet because we were, people's first call. And it was pervasive at the time when people said, why won't you shop online? Oh, I don't trust the internet with my credit card. Even like the SSL browser, people didn't understand when its browser was in secure mode. I mean, there was still so much lack of awareness. People didn't do banking online at the time because it wasn't seen as trustworthy, the internet.
For sure.
So everywhere you heard the comment, one of the biggest things preventing the growth of the internet economy is people's concern over security and privacy. And we took that as validation that if we just built something easy enough, we could sneak in this revolutionary civil rights tool that was like NSA proof and could prevent even governments from tracking you. And we could uplift the rights of individuals while still building something commercially viable. We made a bunch of mistakes in that assumption, but that was the founding assumption.
Yeah. Would you say, were you and your crew kind of activist oriented?
To a certain degree. I mean, listen, I was a nerd. I was a nerd who, so to a keyboard warrior, yes, I would get on and rant about things and talk about, Phil Zimmerman and, the PGP case. When I went to California to go to cypherpunk meetings and I timed it so I was actually at the court case with all the other cypherpunks when, there was a famous kind of crypto court case when someone had shipped the PGP source code on paper to test the law on whether or not you could export encryption.
Interesting. I think I know about this from the books on cryptography history. Yeah. Yeah.
So, we were very much involved and I loved that part of it. Mm-hmm. Some of my feelings towards kind of white hat hacking had emerged, early on, I had done some, white hat hacking where companies paid me to essentially break into their systems. Mm-hmm. So I had kind of grown up in that hacker kind of hacktivist community where the idea of civil liberties and civil rights were very important and often discussed, how to protect your rights against an overburdensome government. And, I think somewhat, my parents, there was a little bit of influence there. My mom comes from a family of, civil rights activists and union organizers. My father comes from a family of lawyers. So,
okay,
certainly, and having a very large family, I have 8 siblings. Yeah. So dinner table was usually a very Socratic teardown of anyone's ideas. And so that served me well when I hopped online and had to defend my ideas as an 11-year-old. So all of that just mixed into, we said, why not? Let's build it. And we thought being in Canada was a great strategic advantage because we could actually export encryption globally. That the U.S. government couldn't regulate. And so we felt it was a perfect storm of everyone saying privacy is their biggest fear. We could actually build a privacy tool that is totally government proof. And we thought that was the ultimate test, like the government trying to shut us down or the government ordering us to reveal an identity. And we couldn't do it. That's where the zero knowledge name came from. We wanted to have zero knowledge about any of our customers.
Did you know the cryptography as well? I'm assuming yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I had read, when I did my deep dive, I would have read Bruce Schneier, Applied Crypto. I had looked at all the various techniques. I had looked at all the patents from David Shope. So I was very familiar with zero knowledge algorithms at the time, which were still pretty new constructs.
Yeah.
But the entire idea that you could prove something without revealing it was interesting from a tech point of view. But we used it as kind of a broader representation of never reveal anything because you don't have to.
Yeah, you had zero knowledge of what was happening in the system. That's perfect.
Yeah. I coined the terms later at Blockstream, can't be evil instead of don't be evil. And I
Yeah.
also coined the don't trust, verify. They were all kind of
Really?
ethos. Yeah.
That's
Those were
great.
kind of marketing slogans that I came up with. But they were all based off the ethos of the cypherpunks. It wasn't
Yeah.
something original of mine. These were, security through transparency. These were open source was something I was raised in. You never trusted anything that wasn't open source. So all of the principles that came from the free software movement, from kind of the activist hippie kind of free software community that had emerged out of California, those were some of my roots. Those were my heroes. I read about these people growing up as a teen.
So cool. One of my questions was a little bit like, why Montreal? But I think you sort of answered it with like, at least why Canada, and you were already living in Montreal. But talk about like building a team in Montreal at that time.
So this is still very early on. And so Montreal had a lot of programmers in the video game special effects industries.
Yeah.
Montreal is kind of known for that. But we were talking about building a new internet protocol, an actual protocol, routing, like low-level TCP/IP, wrapping packets and encryption. We were talking about doing encrypted protocols, which not many people had experience.
What languages would you even be building this stuff in?
Most of it was in C and C++.
Okay.
Because we had a server component that had to write the server rerouting and do all the email handling. So we had to build essentially a core set of internet services, like an encrypted mail server, a mail routing server, the packet servers. And then we also had to figure out how we could get paid for our service without knowing the identity of our users. So we had an eCash project.
Yeah.
That was designed around re-implementing, because if anyone could say, okay, show us who, John Smith spent money with you, show us who his pseudonyms are, the entire service breaks down. If we know who our customers are. So right away, we had designed conceptually how these worked. I knew I needed protocol engineers, and I knew I needed an incredible, very famous cryptographer who could not only vet our designs and implement our vision, but also lend the company some credibility, because we were kind of coming out of nowhere. I had lurked on the cypherpunk list, but our plan was to hire as many of them as possible. So I wanted an emissary. So I hired a friend of ours who was, pretty junior, but a really enthusiastic software engineer at another company, just because I had never built software. I ran an ISP. And I had hacked some code, but I had never shipped commercial software. And then we recruited two different groups. One was a small group of protocol engineers that were working and affiliated with McGill.
Okay.
Because McGill University actually had built a couple of the early protocol versions on the internet. Gopher, Waze, and Archie, which were three ways of navigating the internet before the web.
Wow.
Were built in Montreal. And so we found some team members who had worked on those, because we figured, okay, at least they've done protocol submissions. They've dealt with the IETF. They understand the networking stack. And then I recruited Dr. Ian Goldberg. And that was kind of its own adventure. He was world famous.
Yeah. How did you do that? Like, so reading about him and reading about him even at that time, like he was already a known person. He had found this crazy exploit, had published some amazing work already. So how did you actually recruit him?
I knew he was Canadian, that he had graduated from Waterloo. He was attending Berkeley. His email was out there. He was on the cypherpunk list. I had been following Ian. So he was one of my top 5 to target, but I wanted a Canadian. So over the high holidays, when he was visiting his family for Hanukkah, I contacted his family in Toronto. I said, I'd love to come visit your son and you for a visit, because he was in from California. He was, I think, second year into his graduate degree.
That is so bold. They let you?
I flew
so
to Toronto.
Amazing.
Yeah, flew to Toronto, sat down and explained to his parents that my intentions were clear and I wasn't going to hurt their son or his academic future, because they were terrified I was going to convince him to drop out of school, which I did.
Which you did do in the end. Oh, no.
But I did that I promised that he would go back and finish his PhD, which he did.
Okay.
So he took a leave of absence as opposed to dropout. And yeah, I just sat down with Ian, and Ian really put me through a ringer. He tested my knowledge. He tested my thinking. Have you thought about this attack? What happens when they this way? Have you thought about this protocol? What happened? And I guess over the course of that dinner, he was impressed enough that he flew to Montreal, met with the team of engineers we had put together, which were pretty impressive because they had built internet protocols. And we convinced Ian to join the team as our chief scientist.
Wow. At the beginning, you are in Montreal. You're kind of trying to find some engineers locally, but you're saying like there's engineering talent, but not exactly what you want, but you found some at McGill. Were you like training people up as well? Like, would you have accepted other types of developers and like brought them into the fold?
We did, and we had to. And we ended up, over the course of the company, we put a heavy focus on HR early. So we were always in this recruiting, get the best minds. Some of the same philosophy you saw adopted at Google or in its early days or adopted at the AI companies now. We viewed cryptographers as one of the scarcest resource on the planet.
Wow.
And our goal was not only to hire the best, but then use that as a training model to grow the next generation. So we actually had almost a month-long zero-knowledge university when employees onboarded, where they had to go through the entire history of cryptography, civil rights, online protest. They had to look at comparative systems and comparable. Even if they were working in customer service, we wanted everyone to understand the basics so they could talk intelligently about why what we were doing mattered. We had internal newsletters that talked about events in the world of cryptography.
Incredible.
The company really had kind of a very strong mission-orientated stance as long as we could before the market hit us in the face.
Let's talk about the happy days first, though. So
Sure.
You raised, let's talk a bit about like, you had this initial idea, you had a small team. I'm guessing investors started to be interested. How did you make that happen? You were at a kind of a great moment, I think, in tech, from what I heard.
Yes and no. So it was really interesting. From reading the articles, everything you would read was, all you have to do is, drop your name and say, I'm doing a .com, and venture capital would find you if you were in the Valley. So like money rained down from trees, but no one really, there weren't blogs, there weren't guides, there weren't podcasts. No one had painted a picture to me. I didn't have a mentor who said, here's how you do it.
Or talk to this guy. Yeah, you would have had to like figure this out from scratch. Was there anyone in your family who could like...
Well, my father was a CFO of a large public company. Okay. He was an investor, and he had joined us at Zero Knowledge to become our CFO. My brother had been my partner in the ISP. So we had raised a little bit of money, but the environment in Canada is totally different than the US. So we went to some local meetings. We tested our pitch out, but we knew we were going to have to go to the Valley. Sent a whole bunch of blind faxes just because that's, trying to get people faxing our business plan to a bunch of people. Yeah, because most of the VC funds didn't even have web pages back then.
Yeah.
You were trying to get their email address to email them plans, but really got no response until we kind of tapped into the idea that we had the initial team going. We had invested a couple million, I think, of our own money to just get things moving, but we knew we would need to raise more. And so I submitted, at the time, there was a very famous magazine in the venture community called Red Herring, which was kind of like the TechCrunch of its day.
Yeah.
If you've ever read TechCrunch. Very focused on startups and the VC economy. And they held conferences, and they were holding one in Boston. So you could apply to be able to go pitch as one of the 100 hottest companies they found. And so we put a lot of effort into soliciting and kind of trying to convince the person who oversaw the invites that we should get an invite. We got one. And so out of the 150 startups that they brought, I think there were like 10 of them that were invited to stand up in front of everyone and do a 90-second elevator pitch. And we were selected as one of the companies to stand up in front of a room of 400 people.
Perfect.
And so I was kind of the outside guy for the company and the pitch man. And so, but yeah, it was nerve-wracking. I was getting up in front of, billions of dollars of capital and standing up and trying to convince them to invest in this crazy cypherpunk idea that was so hard to explain to the average person and I had 90 seconds to do it.
Yeah. Were you scared at the time, or were you pretty like confident? I mean, you had already like gone to, was Ian Goldberg already working with you at this point?
Yeah. We had Ian Goldberg. We had code being written. I was very confident, and I was a true believer. And true belief gets you 99% of the way. And an entrepreneur just needs to believe what they're saying. And so I didn't have any doubts. I was just nervous. I mean, as the exercise went on, I saw the first guy get up and like a third of the way in, he starts fumbling his words. He starts humming and hawing, and you feel the entire room go, oh, and you could feel the capital leaving his company. And I'm feeling so responsible. I'm like, I got employees to pay. If I screw this up, this is our entry into the world. So I'm raising the stakes in my head every time I see someone get up, and they all massacred it. Literally. There was
like in a bad way. They all
in a very bad way.
Didn't do well. Okay. Massacred themselves.
Most people, if you'd say, tell me about yourself in 90 seconds, very few people can just stand up and do that, or tell me about your company. It takes practice.
For sure. And
so I generally knew what I wanted to say, but at one point I did start hyperventilating, and I went to the bathroom. I splashed water on my face, and I just visualized. I had done a lot of work in kind of NLP and, visualization. I had done like stage magic as a kid. So I knew how to hypnotize people. And so I just went through like a little mantra to hypnotize myself. And I literally visualized everyone standing up and clapping and throwing money at me. Yeah. And so when it was my turn, I got up and I nailed it.
Amazing. That's cool.
And so they asked the VC, they said, out of all of these, who's most impressive? And he was like, I got to go check out those zero knowledge guys. Either they're the smartest people in this room or they're idiots for calling their company zero knowledge. And I want to go find out.
Wow.
Which was perfect. So we had standing room only. We had meetings backed up. Someone set a private jet for us to Montreal to fly us to Silicon Valley because they found out we were going to meetings and they wanted to have an exclusive chance to convince us to take their money. So it's kind of kickstarted, and we got like a write-up in the magazine as one of the hottest startups to appear there. So it kind of started this kind of darling kind of Cinderella story that we were able to continue for a number of years.
At some point, you did raise money. How much did you get, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so the first tranche, we raised $5 million. Mm-hmm. That was from a couple of the early founders of one of pre-Google competitors, a company called Inktomi that did massive cloud computing that had gone public, that was actually Ian Goldberg's professor at Berkeley, was the CTO there. So we took some money from them, and then that kind of let us start to scale up. We started hiring top cryptographers. We were still working on the software. We were finding that the software was way harder than we thought. So I realized we would need more money. So I think it was 1999, early in 98 or 99. The dot-com boom was still flying.
Yep.
We were getting calls nonstop from big public market investors who were trying to get access to Canadian tech stories. So what was happening in the market at the time is all these companies were going public in the first dot-com boom. Mm-hmm. And Canadian investors couldn't get allocations on the shares. So by the time they could buy Netscape, or by the time they could buy their shares, it was like 10x higher. And so some investors in Toronto and bankers essentially were calling all these Canadian companies and say, we'll take you public right now. There's so much appetite. And we knew we weren't ready to go public.
Yeah.
We had no product. We had no revenue. But the demand was so high that we structured a very unique financing where we went out for 3 days of fundraising meetings. We were planning on raising $10 million, and we were going to do it as what's called a special warrant to convert at a future later price.
What is now a SAFE, kind of?
It was a little different because we had already raised money at a price round.
Okay.
And what we didn't want to do is we didn't want to take, to a certain degree, what we call, and I hate to use this term because it's derogative, but it's called dumb money. But essentially non-strategic money that can add weight to your cap table before you bring in the strategic guys. So we were really focused on raising money from the best California VCs who could help us build a legacy era company. So we wanted people like Kleiner Perkins at the time, who had just taken Netscape public and Google public. We wanted to be in that group. But all these Canadian investors were saying, take our money. So we did 3 days of meetings, and we thought we could maybe raise 10 million. We had an order book for 125 million.
Whoa. You still didn't have your strategic investor, though.
Didn't have the strategic. This was just the non-strategic capital. But the way we had just structured it was we could raise that money without suffering any dilution. It was non-dilutive capital.
Okay.
What most people in the crypto world recognize as ICOs.
Kind of, yeah.
This was actually a promise to issue shares just after we raised the money from strategics. We said
Yeah.
either you get it at the IPO price and so it took advantage of the market, but that gave us 25 million and allowed us to grow very quickly.
Wait, was that 25 or 125?
We took 25 of the
Okay.
125 that was expressed interest. We knew if we took much more than 25,
got it.
It would not be good. But that 25 allowed us to grow. So we grew up to almost 280 employees.
Wow.
We opened an office in Silicon Valley. We were doing projects like with cell phone manufacturers to deploy our eCash. Because one of the questions everyone had is, how do you bootstrap an eCash system? And so we thought it would be perfect at carriers. When you go to pay your cell phone bill, you just load another $20 in eCash.
On your cell phone.
On your cell phone. And we were essentially all talking about stable coins because the idea of independent, non-sovereign money like Bitcoin had really permeated the design space. There were people who were very aware of the benefits of hard money and gold versus state function money. But we all thought that the first eCash system would just be a US dollar on eCash.
Yeah, or some one-to-one. Okay.
That's right.
We've heard about some of the funding to this point, but now I want to go into what's happening in this company. Yeah, how are you getting the messages out about what you are trying to build at this point? So first, what is the company at this point? So like in that phase, I think we're talking 97 to about 99-ish, 2000. Are you already based on Saint Laurent? When did you move on Saint Laurent? Tell me about that.
Okay, so we set up the office on Saint Laurent very, very quickly.
Okay.
So as soon as we had started hiring Ian Goldberg and doing that recruiting and those early protocol engineers and programmers, we had the office on Saint Laurent. It was right next to Schwartz, the corner.
Yeah.
It was the Cooper building on Saint Laurent, 3981 Saint Laurent Boulevard. And we ended up keeping and having office space there for quite a while. But we eventually grew out of that and went to the space that was down on Saint Denis. But we were hiring cryptographers. I had reached out. I started hiring other cryptographers like Dr. Adam Back, Adam Shostak. We had gone to DEF CON a few times and spoken about what we were working on. So there was some early buzz in the hacker, civil liberties, kind of like that DEF CON community was very tied to kind of civil liberties. And I started recruiting advisory board members who we thought could help us. That included some luminaries like Whit Diffie, who invented public key cryptography. Yeah. So we recruited Whit. We recruited Bruce Schneier. So Bruce Schneier came on our advisory board. We started creating this kind of what we refer to a lot as a density of intensity. We wanted the smartest people in crypto all together solving the biggest problems in privacy and anonymity. And that was it. And so we were kind of like, let RSA focus about security. We're going to be what RSA is to security. We're going to be to privacy and cypherpunk. And, there were a bunch of assumptions in there that we're to later find out were very different than reality.
But at the time, Freedom was the central project, as far as I know, right? Like from the start. So were you building all those parts of Freedom, or were you building one part of Freedom from the start? How are you actually approaching it?
There was a certain minimum set of features that just had to work for the loop to work. In our mind, we needed the anonymous networking. So we had built servers, routing protocols, secure crypto, signing of routes. There's a whole set of infrastructure such that you couldn't do a man-in-the-middle attack. You couldn't spoof the network. You couldn't observe the network from a global surveillance point of view and do traffic analysis so that you could associate packets here. So we went all into this design. We wrote white papers, but Freedom was the central product. But how to pay for your pseudonyms, because we were charging basically per pseudonym, how to get on the internet anonymously, and then how to send email and interact, which, because email was the primary form of identifier that you used. All of that we had to build. And so we were building that. I tried to buy DigiCash. It had gone bankrupt at the time. And we thought
tried to buy DigiCash. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
So I flew out to Silicon Valley and I met with the venture capitalists who had it in receivership, and we tried to convince them. I worked with John Gilmore, who was the founder of EFF, kind of incredible gentleman to come up with an idea on how we could set the patents free. So it was essentially an open source patent license that would allow anyone to start building eCash systems, because we really believed that that was one of the biggest barriers. The VCs turned us down and took another offer because we didn't have a lot of cash. But we found a PhD student who worked for David Schoem, Dr. Stefan Brands, and he added the only other workable way to do blinded anonymous electronic cash at the time. And so we hired him and got access to his patents. And so we were building the payment mechanism for eCash and payment, the networking, and the software that ran on your local computer.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
Amazing. What did you end up shipping?
Well, we shipped a lot of stuff, but the big release of Freedom 1.0 was something we celebrated. I mean, we took over our office building. We had like a party on the rooftop. We were so excited, and everyone we had a waiting list of like 20 or 30,000 people, which at the time was a lot,
for the product to be able to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had, because I had spoken at it, I had gone to TED in Toronto and spoken on the TED stage about the importance of privacy and kind of broadcasting. We're going to be building a tool that gives you privacy. We were covered a lot in the newspaper. We did some interesting, what was kind of an extension of hacktivism from my hacker days, but we called it flagtivism. So like Intel released a new CPU that included something called the Pentium serial number, which was a unique identifier on your CPU chip. And they proposed that every time you browse the web, people could track and authenticate you using this identifier. And they said it would lead to better security, because now no one can pretend to be you as long as you control your computer. We, of course, as privacy people, said this is horrible. This is, and
terrible.
even in the Pentium serial number was going over badly. But Intel made all these representations saying no one can read it unless you give permission. It's an opt-in authentication method. And I said, bullshit. I've never seen a system that's, So I set one of my hackers on the team loose on it for a weekend, and he found a way to bypass it and, to essentially surreptitiously track you as you went on the web.
Awful. Yeah.
And so we went on CNN and released it. Intel stock took a dive. Everyone freaked out. Intel actually convinced McAfee and Norton to treat our software as antivirus because they were so pissed off at us.
Oh, whoa.
But so we had this reputation. Like I was on CNN arguing with, one of the executives at Intel about what a horrible idea and how we're just showing users that their own claims were invalid. So it built a kind of a lore around the company where we had some of the best hackers applying to work. We ran a very expensive ad campaign. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's a bunch of children with tattoos across their foreheads and barcodes on the back of their necks.
Oh.
Saying essentially, I'm not a piece of your inventory. Stop treating me as... Anyway, I'll send you a copy. But
crazy. Yeah. I'll try. By the way, I should tell the listeners, we do have a few pieces of material that, Austin, you've been nice enough to share with me. I'm going to add some of these in the show notes. I'll say something more about it maybe later. But if you guys want to check out some of this imagery, what you just described, this is a question I have for you, is like, this sounds like, I don't know if you knew this at the time, Adbusters. Do you remember that magazine?
Yeah, very familiar.
Yeah.
Naomi
Did you
Klein's movement?
Like politically, what was Adbusters was almost like anti-capitalist. You guys were more like free internet, libertarian.
Libertarian, free market. At that point in my kind of age and kind of very into like Atlas Shrugged and kind of going through that whole phase where, rational objectivism and, all that stuff. And in fact, one of our ad campaigns, we embedded in all the barcodes that all the kids were wearing a secret message, and we leaked that there was a message. So like everyone was out trying to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was, it was a quote from Ayn Rand.
Amazing.
So... Yeah, but we did have this kind of activist feeling. Yeah. We had fun gear and shirts. And like when we would go to conferences, everyone was trying to get a copy of one of our crypto shirts and we had some of the smartest people, in crypto working for us.
I feel like in every story you're telling, there's like, you're trying to do something. There's probably a well-trodden path to do that, but you're doing it in a very unusual way. Like the way you get your hiring. And the way you're advertising, like you had sort of known or tapped into kind of mimetic, controversial advertising before there was much knowledge about that, right? Like to pick a fight with a giant tech company. I mean, that's crazy, but awesome.
Yeah. I mean, we believe that, there were certain principles that we were fighting for, and we literally would talk to employees. We said, listen, the future of the internet will be decided in the next decade. We will either be under an advertising model upon which everything is productized and every one of you are productized, or we will be in a model where you own your identity, you control who sees what, and you'll pay for things with anonymous payments, and we can have a healthy balance between individual rights and economic results, economic freedom, choice.
And you were correct.
Sovereign, and we talked about sovereign countries. We talked about the dangers of sovereign censorship, and we were on the front lines of the encryption battles, donating. We contributed to things like social campaigns. Yeah, we cared about this stuff. It wasn't just it wasn't a marketing spin. This was in our DNA.
Yeah, but you were like what you said to your employees at that time. It's 10 years. It's going to go this way or another way. I mean, history sort of showed it did end up going the way of advertising.
There were a couple factors. So I spoke at this conference, a very popular conference run by Esther Dyson called PC Forum at the time. It was kind of, a big industry event. And I was talking about privacy because everyone was talking about privacy. But by then we started to see that what they say about privacy and what they do are never really correlated.
Totally.
People make horrible decisions. Privacy is this ephemeral concept that means different things at different times. It's so contextual. And people didn't just have a nuanced understanding. So I made this kind of joke saying, if I survey 100 people, if they care about their privacy, I can get 97 people to put up their hand. If I get the same 100 people on another day and ask who wants to 6 months free big of McDonald's in exchange for DNA samples,
they'll do that.
97 people will put up their hand. And so it was just this unfortunate reality that people didn't understand what the real value of our stuff was unless they were cypherpunks. So we've kind of built a tool for a very small market, even though the trends and the issues were right.
Yeah.
And we started to encounter this. We saw that the actual adoption rate versus interest wasn't there. The retention, part of that was just the tool was so early that it was slow. There was latency. And we were subsidizing the infrastructure on the back end. So it's costing us money and we're trying to expand the use case. But meanwhile, we've got just teams of some of the smartest people. And every time there was a privacy crisis, we started getting phone calls.
Yeah.
So like there was a major advertising network that tried to do an acquisition at the FTC. This was DoubleClick at the time. They tried to buy a data broker company to make their ads more targeted. And the FTC came in and almost shut it down because of privacy laws, because everyone was debating privacy laws. And so at the time, we started talking about, hey, we can apply our crypto tools to a lot of different problems in privacy. It's not just the consumer. What if there's, businesses that actually want to use data, but need to have that data blinded? Once again, an extension of the zero knowledge algorithms and the ideas. So we started taking on some custom contracts. We started doing prototyping of technologies, including like the eCash mobile phone. We were working on some technologies that would help people protect large databases and essentially anonymize data requests. So we started expanding laterally before any one part of it was working. And then kind of and that's when we kind of peaked in our headcount and our spending levels. And then two things kind of happened at once. One, the dot-com crash.
Which is, what year is this? 2001? 2000?
Yeah, 2000. Yeah, it was 6 months into 2000, I think, is the official time that people talked about the crash happening.
I remember at the time I had just started to look at stocks. I think it's the only time in my life I really looked at stocks, actually, in the lead up to that, because tech companies were kind of this interesting stock to look at. It was like all of a sudden, because stock markets had this, I don't know, they were pretty dry. And all of a sudden there's these really interesting tech things. You'd kind of recognize the name. There were there was some really cool stuff. And I remember the crash quite vividly.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain degree, there were a whole bunch of bad ideas that were horribly overfunded, but there were also incredible companies that were just early and had needed some time to catch up. I mean, in the crash, Amazon went, I think, famously down to a couple bucks a share. And, a decade later,
Yeah.
it's, one of the biggest companies in the world because, we saw the adoption of broadband that was driving use and use cases because you could now connect at higher speeds. But two things kind of happened simultaneously or kind of in a row. There was the dot-com crash. We had to go out and raise money to keep the lights on because we were now spending a lot of money. And I found an investor and they basically, as soon as they walked in, they said, assume that's the last money you're ever going to get. You need to totally rehaul the company because you're spending way too much for how much. And they were right. Because we thought there were a lot of companies that would go public before they had found their perfect niche. They were just famous internet companies.
Yeah.
And so to a certain degree, we were on that trajectory and we were like, RSA went public many years before it was profitable. So it wasn't a crazy idea to go public based off aspirational long-term goals in that environment. Now, we now know that it was way too early and a bunch of those companies' business models didn't survive and they used way too much capital. But so we were already looking internally and looking at what could we do differently? How can we, if we had to prioritize. And then 9/11 happened. 2001. We had already had a working plan to shut down the Freedom Network when it happened. Unfortunately, even though that was our baby, it was just costing us way too much. And we had done a whole bunch of stuff to market it. We partnered with, press groups, different select communities online, victims of sexual abuse, people in the GLBT community, people we thought might have a more inclination to privacy. We had, done some affiliate marketing where we bundled. We tried to do retail to see if we had a box next to Semantic and McAfee, but it's an expensive game. So we really had looked at all these different distribution strategies and way to scale, and we couldn't connect the dots. Yeah. So we were rationalizing and looking internally, and then 9/11 happened, which obviously made, not that we were afraid to be activists but they were passing the Patriot Act.
Totally.
And we had, we were screaming from the rooftop, even if the FBI or CIA asks us, you can't track us.
Privacy in that moment was not popular. Had it been 12 years later, 2013, with the Snowden revelations, it would have been the perfect time.
Absolutely. And pretty much every threat we talked about protecting was designed with all of the stuff we assumed was happening that we later found out from Snowden was actually happening. They were running taps at all the ISPs. They were running network access point, internetwork access point taps. So the unwarranted mass surveillance that we imagined was occurring.
So you had already decided to sort of wind it down, or not wind down Freedom.
Yeah.
But you had all these other products, I guess. Did you basically you kind of hinted at this too, that there were some companies that might actually be interested. So you started with a very B2C product. You would pay, like the customer would pay, they would get access to this private environment. They would personally make, all these different email accounts and everything. But at some point you're realizing you can't sell it. So what did you have left? Like what could you actually sell to businesses?
Well, we were doing some contracts, but none of them individually were paying for the whole. They were all early stage initiatives doing customer discovery, what we now know as kind of minimum viable product or MVP builds. We were still looking for that one that just had enough weight. And part of that was distribution strategies. So, we had done some deals in Japan to translate the software, and we did a deal with Hewlett-Packard to actually bundle our software on every computer that was shipped for a number of years. Every HP computer had both a Semantic antivirus tool, but then it had our tool for desktop firewall, for protecting your privacy, ad blockers. So we had some components of the software that still worked in kind of a desktop security setting. And so eventually what we ended up kind of transitioning to was actually a model like that, where it turns out people couldn't distinguish between what a security tool and a privacy tool should do. Norton and Semantic and McAfee all added some ad blocker and anti-spyware features to prevent hostile code that wasn't viruses. And so their tools became kind of this all-in-one security suite. We then said, well, we need to respond just to be competitive because we're losing deals. We licensed an antivirus engine from a third party, embedded it, and started to go head to head with McAfee and Symantec for deals. And we focused on internet providers. So we started to partner with internet providers where they could go to their customer and say, well, we can scan your PC from here. We found 40 pieces of spyware that's tracking and slowing down your connection. For $5 a month, we can protect you. And so our tool was distributed by TELUS, by Bell. We knew internet providers because of our history there.
From your past,
Yeah, we had tried to do distribution deals with them before, but it turns out that monthly service, the same way answering machines gave way to voicemail on your cell phone or on your home line, right? Like it was kind of a natural transition that the ISP started to say, we'll give you security protection for an additional few dollars a month. And so over time, from like 2002 to 2008 or 9, that business became very profitable. And we shut down and had to shut down a lot of the other things, which was sad because we had to let go of a lot of these incredible cryptographers.
Yeah.
And we referred to the staff as freedom fighters, and people had moved from around the world to make this their job, to make Montreal their home. We had 20 or 30 people from Silicon Valley who had sold their homes and moved out, so it was tough, and we had to shrink that. And we, at one point, got it down to 60.
Wow.
And then we started rebuilding the company and, focused on something but it was very different from the original aspirations.
Did you stay on through this entire time? Most of
it, yeah. It was 2006, 2007. Our business with the internet providers had really become it. I, at one point, had spent a couple of years running another of the divisions that we tried to spin out, which was doing the enterprise data stuff. So we were working with large healthcare companies and large banks to anonymize the data in their database so that employees couldn't get raw access to people's data. So we still kind of considered that on mission. And we did a couple multi-million-dollar contracts, like proof of concepts, prototypes, but it wasn't ever something that we got off the ground sustainably. And so when I came back to the company, it was so different from what it originally was. My brother had done an incredible job instituting really kind of good management, like accountability, what are you doing? What's it costing? What's the case for it? And he's great at that stuff. And that was just never my mindset. I was always more missionary than mercenary.
And you're very creative from what I gather too.
Yeah, it was tough. And I felt myself more kind of being like an executive at a tech company than someone trying to change the world with tech. And that kind of led to, me butting heads a little bit over culture with my brother, and which really wasn't fair to him, frankly, because, he had turned the company around and he had kind of really done the heavy lifting to get the company operating. And so me coming back in and saying, oh, I prefer to do things this way wasn't really, kosher. It's like when parents fight in front of kids. So at one point I was just like, you know what? I love startups. I love the early stage. I'm going to go back to doing that.
Yeah.
And so I left the company in 2007. They went on later to have a couple really good exits that benefited me and benefited our investors and family. So they were able to sell off and kind of take some private equity and create some liquidity. And I started doing angel investing and started working with a venture capital firm, and then played my hand at a few other startups.
Yeah, one of which is pretty well known as well.
Eventually, yeah.
Because that's like a whole nother story. Before we go into that story, I do want to ask you just a few kind of last questions about maybe the heyday of Zero Knowledge. I think you heard my 15-minute story about my connection point. Jonathan has already shared some of this, but you made this company, so I want to double check it with you. And I also want to talk about some of the details of the space and the location that you were at. So as I described in that story, Saint Laurent Boulevard, the main, is kind of like it's actually the street in Montreal, which, like, if you go east of it, the streets are going east, and like it's a demarcation point between east and west of the city. Did you have a sign on the Cooper building?
No. We didn't have a sign outside. We had a rolling billboard that we used from recruiting. I think I heard Jonathan tell that story. So we were very aggressive with recruiting, and we would send out a mobile billboard to drive around every software company morning, noon, and after work to get all the employees kind of, thinking about a career change. But yeah, I mean, that was our neighborhood. We were right next to you. We would go out to dinner, lunches at Schwartz or Coco Rico, the Portuguese chicken place.
Yeah.
We would bring
Yes.
business associates into dinner and be sitting at the Globe or Buena Notte. And Saint Laurent was our hometown, and that was our main street. Yeah. And then we were down by Saint Denis, which was the after hours club was right next door. And there was still kind of that nightlife.
Stereo, I think.
Yep.
This is a funny... So, I found out that I was right across the street from one of your offices. So when did you make the move down there?
I think it was 1999, 2000.
Okay.
It took us a while to make the move. We ran both offices in parallel because we had 3 floors in the new office. So the minute one floor was ready, we moved off a group of employees, and then we slowly transitioned the rest.
Okay. I lived down near the other office right at the time you were working. You would right around that time. I think it was in the year 2001, summer 2001. And I don't know if you remember a bar called Biftech. I think you were going to nicer places than this, but I was a waitress at Biftech. So
we may have crossed paths, but yeah, no. Montreal at the time was we felt like a big fish in a small pond. We were one of the few companies that was recruiting like we saw out in Silicon Valley, where this fight for talent. So we had we felt like we had our pick of some of the best people that the town could offer. And we were recruiting a lot of people. And, we had government support. We had lots of press and attention. But, everything that goes up comes down. And, a lot of the same reporters who chronicled our rise to fame enjoyed chronicling our descent. And that's just part of life.
Was it really it wasn't your first startup, but you were very young. Was it deeply painful, for you?
Oh, yeah. It was, firing people is never fun. Letting people go through that because of something that they didn't do. Letting high performer, really talented people go just because the business strategy doesn't work. The business requires a different set of skills. I personally recruited a lot of these people, but we went overboard to try and do it the best way possible. We really said, even if we have to lay off half our company today, we kept the HR team. They fired themselves last, and we employed them as an outplacement agency. And we told them, none of you go home until everyone finds a job, because it was a very tough environment. In the background of the .com era, people were laying off people. So we wanted to make sure our people landed very well. And so we spent a lot of effort in trying to make sure we did it in a very good way. And over time, as we began to find a formula that worked, we rehired a lot of those people. But, some of the skill sets just weren't applicable. But no, most of our people were legendary in their field. And so they landed on their feet very well. But yeah, it was painful. It was tough on me. It was tough on everyone.
Yeah. To be honest, I do have more questions on Zero Knowledge itself, what it was like to work there, the research group, and some of the projects. Jonathan alluded to some of these. Maybe I should have someone on from that group. Who was in charge of research? Who led research?
There were different people. There was an Evil Geniuses group that had, and they were called the Evil Geniuses, and it was Adam Shostak, Ian Goldberg, Adam Back was in there, Ulf Moeller, who did OpenSSL and was kind of a famous cryptographer. Anyway, we had a bunch. Stefan Brands was in that group. So that was kind of our pure and applied research. And then we also had top-end hackers on the Windows side, protocol engineers. So there was just a culture of very elite, high-end engineers. And you knew there were always smarter people than you in the room. And that was a very invigorating environment to be in.
I feel like I do want to bring someone on who is in there. Jonathan had been part of it, but I think he was only part of it for a pretty short period of time and was hired more as a hacker to break stuff, as he described it. I actually, after releasing the first sort of story, I have received a few little notes from people who worked at Zero Knowledge Systems. And I'm hoping to do at least one more episode on this, and maybe quote some of them or, bring some of them up. It would be really fun to continue that.
Happy to discuss offline if someone fits the bill for you. But
sounds good.
I think for many of us, it was a combination of an incredible time. It was very passionate and invigorating. But at the same time, it was a disappointing because a lot of us have throughout the years. And I get employees who reach out to me at various times and they'll show me something in the newspaper. I mean, that's how I first discovered Bitcoin. I literally had ex-employees emailing me saying, have you seen this Bitcoin thing? And I was kind of like, I was still sour because we had spent almost $10 million trying to build an eCash system, only to see it fail. And so my attitude initially was, I'm glad someone figured it out. I don't know if I want to spend time on it again because it's still pretty raw.
Yeah. Okay, now let's move on to another chapter. You had left Zero Knowledge Systems. You were doing investments. You were kind of dabbling.
I was dabbling, but I had actually taken a break. So sometime around 2010, 2011, I had to put one of my startups in the ground, which was unfortunate, but it was just time to close it. I had a couple other things just happening in my life. And I kind of hit that point. I was in my mid-30s and I looked around and I was like, for the last 20 years, I've done nothing but build companies and work. And that's been my entire life. Like most of my friendships were based in work because, I didn't go to university. I went right into building companies. I dropped out of high school and started building companies. So I was just kind of rethinking some things. And so I took some time off. I literally would pride myself on how many months I could go without looking at my email. And it became a matter of pride that I'd gone like 7 months without email.
Amazing.
And I played some poker because I fell in love with the game of poker. So I was playing a lot of high stakes poker and largely just kind of wandering and kind of, I felt like I would love to find something meaningful like Zero Knowledge was. So there was a little bit of searching, but I wasn't actively looking at it. And then Adam Back, Dr. Adam Back, I'm sure some of your listeners are very familiar. It's quoted in the Satoshi white paper. He had worked for me. We had kept in touch over the years. And in early 2013, he started sending me some increasingly adamant messages to stop screwing around with my life and start paying attention to Bitcoin. Essentially,
Wow.
He was much more polite than that, but
Well, he knew what you could do. He had seen you in action, I guess. That's interesting. What, like he, in the meantime, had been at Microsoft or something?
He had a couple of stops. He spent some time at Microsoft working on a lot of their security for their single sign-on product, Passport, which was the MSN kind of single sign-on passport system. After that, he got recruited by one of the senior executives at Microsoft who did another startup called PyCorp that then sold to VMware. So he was the chief security architect, and he was kind of at what we refer to in the startup world as resting investing. So he had to stay for 4 or 5 years to earn his payout. But he had just, finished kind of working very intensely in a startup. So he had dived into Bitcoin very intensely. And he, of course, went right to the protocol, right to the source code. And he's talked about this. I don't want to tell his story, but he had spent a year working with a lot of the core developers proposing various ways to improve or change Bitcoin, including adding layer 2 functionality through an idea called sidechains, which no one had proven was possible, but the theory was there. And so he had called me a few times, and once he convinced me to actually pay attention and go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I was within like 9 days totally sold, back into it, like couldn't sleep.
Okay.
I had read everything. I had caught up on everything. I understood why it was different and how it fit in my world mental model that I had built up over a number of years working on eCash systems. So I flew to Malta where Adam was living, and we flew in a couple of the other core developers who were living in Europe and said, hey, here's our crazy idea. We want to get funding for the core developers. We want to invest heavily in improving the protocol and making sure Bitcoin can, grow to its full potential. We want to be a very engineering kind of science, kind of think tank and get the best and brightest. And so we spent the next couple months flying around the world, meeting with core developers, holding like hacker houses where we'd invite some of the top cryptographers in the world to test our ideas. And at the end of that process, it was clear that we could build sidechains, or at least enough that we could put our name next to the idea and say, this is what we want to do. And I went out and raised money. And so, we raised a $21 million seed round. At the time, it was just a list of people and me and a whiteboard.
Wow.
But we were able to, it was the right mix of incredible team, incredible time in Bitcoin. Bitcoin had just peaked to 1,200 and then dropped back down to 300, but the Silicon Valley bug had been caught. So
Yeah.
most VCs were looking to make a bet in crypto and or Bitcoin. And we were seen as kind of some of the thought leaders because of the incredible resumes and people we had around us.
Interesting. Who are all the co-founders? Because there's a long list on Wikipedia.
Yeah. So we ended up having around 8 or 9 co-founders. So in these hacker houses, we were constantly evaluating how people work together, how people contributed good ideas, who would we want to create a company with. We were very conscious because we knew we'd be accused of trying to hijack Bitcoin for like corporate interests because it was an open source project. Red Hat got accused of that when Red Hat became commercial and started working on Linux full time. So we were cognizant of, hey, certain people are better to sit outside because if we hire too many, we're seen as a centralizing destructive force in Bitcoin. And we got those criticisms regardless, even though we were trying to design around that. But we also wanted just people who were incredible engineers who could work with each other very well. So, and most of these guys only knew each other through IRC. They had very few of them. They had worked together for years on Bitcoin Core, but they had, in many cases, hadn't done a lot of in-person meetings. And so the hacker houses served as a way for these guys to live together, hang out together, work on ideas. And emerging out of that was the core team. So it was myself and another gentleman on business. Jonathan was heading up our network security administration. Adam oversaw all the technology and science part of it. And then Greg Maxwell, who's obviously very famous in the crypto Bitcoin world. He's responsible for probably most of the incredible ideas that are still being realized. He was behind Taproot. He was behind a lot of these designs. So anyway, we had Peter Woolley, who had written more code. He and Matt Corello had written most of the code. I think it was something like 70 or 80% of the Bitcoin code was authored by one or the two of them. Mark Friedenbach. So there was a whole group of really talented kind of core essential team. We gave them all generous equity packages. We pioneered kind of a Bitcoin bond program where we not only gave stock options, but we also gave Bitcoin to every employee on a vesting schedule because we wanted everyone aligned with the mission of improving Bitcoin. And we raised a lot of money, 21 million. And then almost very, very quickly after that, we raised another 55. Just because, frankly, the market was hot. And we knew that a very obvious business model for a bunch of engineers in Bitcoin wasn't exactly clear. Because open source business models tend to focus on SaaS subscriptions like, Webley month. So they'll run MySQL on a hosted server and sell subscriptions to it. It doesn't work on crypto when not your keys, not your coins. This Red Hat model of selling support wasn't viable. It's not a big business. No one was paying support contracts on Bitcoin Core. We didn't want to become an exchange. We didn't want to become a financially regulated entity or financial entity. We wanted to be kind of the Cisco of money is how we saw ourselves. And we saw Bitcoin being the TCP IP of money. So we had this analogy in our head that, there will be products and infrastructure, but we're not exactly sure which ones are going to take off. So we started just shipping open source code. And we were like, let's just ship open source code and see what emerges. And we knew that to do that, we needed a lot of runway. We needed a lot of cash in the bank to be able to sustain ourselves. So that's why we raised a lot of capital quite quickly.
Were you buying Bitcoin? Like, did you ever think of it as possibly speculative, like almost running as a hedge fund, meanwhile not worrying about revenue?
We had a lot of discussions. We looked at mining. Some of those internal debates, I just, as long as the company's still there and it's being run by Adam, I don't want to go and, be telling too many inside stories. But we looked at everything and we dabbled in some different stuff. I mean, the company did go into doing Bitcoin mining and was providing infrastructure and tools and services around Bitcoin mining. They acquired another team at one point that was doing ASIC design, and they started working with a lot of the chip manufacturers who are making ASIC chips. So there was, they went into doing a hardware wallet, the Blockstream Jade, which is a great product. We did a Blockstream satellite, and a lot of these happened after I ended up leaving Blockstream. But Blockstream Satellite was, essentially a free service just to make sure that, someone couldn't censor your access to the Bitcoin network at the ISP level. So we started to beam the blockchain from space. So there was this mix of kind of open source community projects that we just did just to support the community and trying to find a viable business model that could sustain all of those.
And did you?
Not while I was there. And so I won't take credit or speak to the work they've done since. They've gone on to raise money. They've gone on to, continue to ship products. Adam and has a great team over there. And that team has changed over time as the, mission changes. And companies also just evolve and grow. They need new talent over time. I left Blockstream actually halfway through 2016. So it was not even 3 years in. And part of that was just I had spent the last year and a half living on the road. I had spent maybe 25 days. I think I looked at the calendar year for my taxes, and I had only spent 25 days at home the entire year.
Yeah.
Most of the team ended up being in San Francisco, which wasn't the original plan. Originally, we were going to have a big base of employees in Montreal, and
Really?
I thought I could
yeah. Damn.
We had started, and we had some offices in Montreal, but the original plan was that we were going to have everyone move to Montreal for a year, get to know each other, work in the same room together, and then evolve into kind of a hybrid, remote, decentralized structure.
Okay.
And we ended up going decentralized a lot faster than we planned. So between that and fundraising, and I wasn't taking care of my health well. And so at one point I was just, had a discussion between Adam and I, and we both decided it was, a good time. We had just raised a lot of money. There was plenty of cash in the bank. And so I left the company and did some angel investing after that. But, Bitcoin, it was also right after the block size wars.
Mm-hmm.
And the block size wars really, I took personally.
Oh, you were in the trenches fighting.
It wasn't so much my fight because I wasn't a core developer. I wasn't taking it on the chin, but I saw employees of mine who were getting death threats. We had to hire security. We had employees end up in the hospital, with both physical, anxiety attacks to the point where they were passing out in the office because someone had swatted them.
Yeah.
So it was a very toxic environment. And these people were the least interested in monetary gain. And they were entirely ethically, we had to write it in their contracts that they had a veto on company actions, that if they ever felt we were violating something that was good for Bitcoin to benefit the company, they could quit publicly and get a full severance, have all their salary paid.
Wow.
And they could essentially shame us into doing the right thing. And we designed that on purpose because we wanted to make sure that the company never went against Bitcoin. And these people were being accused of being traitors to Bitcoin for fighting for what they really honestly believed was the best engineering choice.
Yeah.
And so the engineering had gotten so politicized that it was a very toxic environment. And I was trying to help my people the best way I could. And I didn't feel like I really could because it was once you get into a war, it's very hard to get out of.
Yeah. I joined this space. I said this to Jonathan. I joined the space in 2017. After a lot of this had resolved itself. I think what I saw was more like the Ethereum Bitcoin battles. The ends of that, I think eventually those chilled out as well.
I mean, I was friends with Vitalik's father. I still, not really friends, but we were associates in the business community, and Vitalik studied under Ian Goldberg at Waterloo before he dropped out of school. I appeared on a lot of panels with Vitalik, and certainly had our differences. But suffice it to say, everyone felt like they had to pick the way they fought that battle in different ways. And even inside of Blockstream, we didn't always agree. We agreed on what we were fighting for, but how to fight that battle wasn't unanimous. And so, there was kind of this constant question of, if you look into the darkness long enough, do you become the darkness? And we were literally saying, there were lies out there being spread that we were, part of the CIA global elite, and that we were involved in, Bilderberg meetings, and, because one of our investors that had given us a nominal insignificant amount was associated with it. So it's just all this FUD and conspiracy and lies, and it became a very toxic, hard to get work done environment.
Yeah.
And I was so proud of our company and the brand and the ethics and the things we chose. I took it really personally when we were getting, I wasn't in the right mental and emotional state myself where I could just kind of let the stuff slide off my back. We had a couple people work for us who had worked at Mozilla, And I was studying a lot about open source communities, healthy communication patterns. And there were some academics who had actually done some great work in studying open source communities, where they broke down, why they fork. And I got the name of this consultant who led offsites and workshops. And he had worked with the Tor group when they went through a lot of their challenges. He had worked in crypto. He had worked with Mozilla. And I got stellar recommendations from him. And I was trying to hire him both to help us do some internal mental health and communication skill development, but also see if we could equip our members to bring some of these principles into the broader open source community, because we saw how toxic things were getting. And in some cases, I think some of that toxicity was in response to unwarranted attacks, but it kind of became the knee-jerk reaction where like everyone is a scam. All altcoiners are scammers. Everyone got into tribe thinking and tribe mentalities to such a degree that, everyone feels like what they're doing is right. And so you had people on the other end who were calling us criminals and saying we were stealing Bitcoin or crippling its growth by encouraging, smaller blocks. And it got pretty vicious. And I tried to hire this person. And it was so fascinating. He audited us. He met with the team. And at the end, he said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you." And I'm like, "You're literally one of the few experts in the world who's done crypto and open source." And he goes, "Yeah, but never money." He goes, "I got into this in open source communities for the ethos, the kind of hippie, the free software." And he goes, "I tap into that to get people to think we're all in this together. We're building stuff together." He goes, "But money's a zero-sum game, and everyone's incentives are always suspect when you assume the other person's getting rich off their opinions."
Wow.
He goes, "I just don't know how you create a healthy environment when you can't build trust."
Yeah.
And he goes, "You literally guys are paranoid as it stands because you're all cryptographers whose ethos is don't trust." And then every move by everyone, including your own moves that are totally innocent, get put under a magnifying glass and people accuse you of having unethical motives. And it was a wake-up moment for me that it was going to be a very, very tough road. And I think Blockstream and the small blocker community and the open source community more than anything, because ultimately it was the user initiative around the SegWit and the, which fork to adopt. It was kind of a mass consumer effort, which I think strengthened Bitcoin. And anyone can look back and say that was the right decision. Bitcoin shouldn't be decided by companies, CEOs, including us, shouldn't be decided by edict or kings. Bitcoin is a loosely bound consensus around protocols, and there's a way to deal with forks and debates. And I think the right answer won out, but I know that some of the after effects of that are still, it burned out a lot of incredible people. It turned people away and who joined and I think started working on coins that had less viability or less technical strength or technical assuredness. And they went to that because they felt the community was less toxic. And so, Bitcoin was born out of steel and born in a very hostile, violent environment.
Yeah.
But no one wants to hang out and spend their afternoons in Mount Doom, where the one ring can be burnt. Yes, it builds the one ring. It is very powerful, but it's not where you want to take your lunch break.
Yeah.
And we were living in it all the time. And so it was healthy for me to step back. And I did a little bit of angel investing, including in Jonathan's company and Jeremy's company, Cloaked Wireless. Invested in a few venture capital funds that support the Bitcoin community.
Yeah, I wondered did you leave Bitcoin or did you sort of stay around? Like, are you still following it? Are you still involved?
I don't follow the day-to-day anymore, but I am a Bitcoiner. I always have been. It's, I've never owned another asset in cryptocurrencies, never needed to. I was very happy. I used to track every single, movement in the industry. I'm not close to it at that level anymore. And Bitcoin has also emerged to be a different point. But, I still talk to Adam regularly. I talk to a bunch of ex-employees at different times. And I'm still very optimistic and encouraging of Bitcoin, but I'm not hands-on.
I got it. You have sort of repeatedly, though, managed to find a topic before the rest of the world finds it. I feel like naming your company Zero Knowledge long before Zero Knowledge was usable, but it has since become quite usable.
It's certainly encouraging to see more companies and see a podcast named Zero Knowledge. And, I can go back and I'll send you some of the ads and some of the T-shirt designs. We had some really great taglines.
Oh, that would be so cool.
even the domain names. I had someone try and buy one of the zero knowledge domain names from me recently. I think I mentioned that to you. And, I was surprised by the offer. It was like, not insignificant amount of money, which shows there's funded companies with money in the space.
Interesting.
And who knows, I may revisit that decision and sell it eventually.
But so you were early on these concepts. You were early on Bitcoin too. What are you doing today? I feel like it might be interesting for folks. What is exciting to you today?
So, I think we all want to be the heroes in our own journey, and but I always kind of had this feeling that like I'm at my best when I don't feel like it's work, it's play.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to create our companies around that, and it was always driven around some sort of very overarching mission. Like I said, I was always more missionary than mercenary. It was never about how many dollars can I squeeze out of this market, although I am a capitalist and I believe a healthy company is one that's measured by its profits and its efficiency. But I didn't believe in rent-seeking business models. I always felt like if I have to choose between being parasitic part of an ecosystem or not being part of it at all, I'm happy to walk away.
Got it.
And part of that is just I've been incredibly lucky and very lucky to have found financial success kind of falling from one passion to another.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have a little bit of choice, and I thought I was done. I thought I was retired, living in a country in Central America, enjoying my best life.
Okay.
Beaches, married, at a very different point in my life. And once again, a former engineer called me and said, you need to pay attention to something, and I won't stop bothering you until you give me some time. I think my entire career is smarter engineers than I kicking my ass and convincing me to spend time on something.
Funny.
But this was in an area that's so far out of my domain that I spent almost a good year studying and learning. And it's positional chemistry for what's called direct mechanosynthesis, which in very simple terms is the idea of building something atom by atom, turning atoms into Lego blocks. And it was popularized by a scientist named Eric Drexler. You might know it as nanotech, but this is real nanotech. This is essentially, we have, stain-resistant khakis that people call nanotech pants when it's, actually just a particle
blend.
they spray. But so a lot of stuff claims to be nanotech, but this is actually rebuilding the world that we know for atom by atom. It will lead to breakthroughs in quantum sensors, quantum computers, medical devices. If achieved, it's up there with AGI as the single most important technology we'll develop this century. And it's the single thing that will end human suffering fastest if we develop it.
Wow.
Because literally we can manage disease, suffering, energy, compute at the atomic scale. And ever since Feynman gave his speech in 1959, there's plenty of room at the bottom, which is kind of a famous speech. I've been fascinated, but I never knew the science. And Mark, before he got into Bitcoin and blockchain, this was his passion. And he had studied it and determined that it was just too early. And after he left Blockstream, he revisited that and actually found a bunch of scientists who had been working a decade on it in some secret lab and who had just been let go. And we started working with them and figured out that we think in the next 3 to 4 years before the 70th anniversary of Feynman's speech, which was December 29th, 1959, we think we can have a breakthrough that will unlock and kickstart this the same way ChatGPT did for AGI.
Is it like 3D printing, like atom, like molecules?
It's essentially 3D printing of atoms to build molecules. And then over time, you can build more complex and you can bootstrap a factory of 3D printers that are actually atomic scale. So you can start to build huge volumes, because to build anything that's human size, you would have to do hundreds of millions of atoms. It's really hard to grasp the scale, but I can give you some ideas like, if you would think of the entire planet Earth being the size of an apple, kind of relative scale, that's what an atom is to the Earth. An atom is the size to the Earth as an apple is to the Earth. And so the idea that we can build tools that can get down and manipulate at the atomic level was just sci-fi for much of the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And there hadn't been a lot of attempts. And latest breakthroughs in AI, in quantum sensing, in a series of technologies that allow us to do detailed imaging have shown us that we can actually start to do this and replicate it at scale. And so, we can start to print 3D diamonds that are functional quantum qubits. You to build a quantum computer with like 95% less qubits because it has error-free and it operates at room temperature. We can build quantum sensors that can, detect magnetic fields at levels never seen before. It's one of these transformative foundational technologies up there with electricity, the semiconductor. We will have this, and it'll be the engine that powers the next 100 or 200 years of our society. And so when I saw that was possible, and Mark was showing me how much money he needed and knocking on my door for help, I decided, after I spent time and met the team, I once again decided I would come out of retirement. So that's what I'm doing full time now.
Nice. Looking back over all of this, going back to the zero knowledge systems ethos and privacy, and like the world, I think, picked up on what you were saying about privacy eventually, kind of. But do you feel like are we in a good way? Or have we missed the boat on some of these things? Do you think we still have that chance of getting a private future?
I'm not one to give up hope, but I feel like to a large degree the privacy battle has been lost. In the face of AI, in the face of big data, in the face of just the pervasiveness of data sources, in an environment where politics and misinformation online have just overtaken pretty much most debates in terms of first principles thinking, or the idea that mass adoption of cryptography as kind of an individual civil rights, I think it's really, really hard to get that idea through. And it always comes at a cost. And so, people have to change their behaviors. They have to give up on certain things. There's a reason why these companies offer discounts for the shopping cart and all these things. It's because they make so much money off that data. And you're fighting entrenched economic interests that are very hard to displace, national security interests that are very hard to disrupt. We saw, what governments did to developers of crypto software or privacy enhancing tools. And over time, I just feel like that becomes even tougher because we have just more sensors, more data. Our cars are sensors, our cars are reporting and devices, our phones are devices. We'll have smart clothing, we'll have embedded sensors in our body that are literally reporting at a molecular level our health and our response to things. And so one of the things we coined was privacy by design. We actually came up with that term, and we held a bunch of workshops and conferences where we would bring in engineers and talk about designing privacy into the base protocols of whatever you're building. Those ideas have survived. And so there are people out there who take courses on engineering. I still think we can do better. I think we should have cryptography and strong privacy by default. And our use of these algorithms is still very immature and not widely deployed. But associating them with a use case becomes tougher and tougher and tougher. And the power of AI and the power of even de-anonymization techniques just seems to grow.
Yeah.
And so you're in kind of this asymmetric battle where I think the best we can hope for now is to make sure that there are always tools for dissension, because our society won't survive without that. And we're already seeing the use of AI for mass lying, mass hypnosis of the public, turning, large parts of our population, into what one or both sides refer to as sheeple, because everything's so political. Do you believe in civil rights? Well, to point at the issue, some person advocates for it one day and totally believes that person shouldn't have it the next. And that's kind of not how civil rights work. Bitcoin is designed for people you hate. That was the whole idea. Cryptography is designed for speech that you hate.
Yeah.
It's not designed for speech that you love. And so I would love to see those ideas persist. And my best hope is that we have mature and very good tools so that if someone does find themselves having to speak out against oppression, having to speak out against a government or an organization or a corporation that has too much power, that we always have some set of tools that allow them, like Satoshi, to adopt a pseudonym and make their voice heard.
Yeah.
And I hope that continues to exist.
Totally. Do you think Satoshi might have worked at your company, Zero Knowledge Systems?
So, a couple of responses. Early on in my days in Bitcoin, a number of us got together, core developers, and we talked about just what we wanted our stance to be. Because many of us assumed that one or many of us might know Satoshi.
Yeah.
And we really had strong, deep ethical conversations about the dangers of doxing someone and, contributing to their loss of pseudonymity. We had just seen Dorian Nakamoto be
Like
claimed,
bothered. Yeah.
bothered and harassed. We knew Fran. Hal Finney was a good friend of ours. Most of us knew Hal Finney. Hal and his wife Fran were harassed until he died. And even after he died, she continues to get swatted. And so there was this dining cryptographers problem proposed by David Shom years ago, where if a bunch of people thought they knew a secret, could you build a crypto protocol? And it's around the idea of, could someone pick up the tab, but you could prove you picked up the tab without everyone knowing who picked up the tab.
Yeah.
But by proving you picked up the tab, you weren't revealing your identity. And so we kind of drew, even though it wasn't exactly that, we all said, you know what, we're doing the world a disservice if we contribute to this. Now, Adam was later named, and there's a whole bunch of conspiracy videos naming him.
Peter Todd was recently named, I think, in a documentary. Oh, and Jack from Twitter.
Jack recently, yeah. So it was funny. Just as a joke, I took an ex-employee of ours who actually was murdered, unfortunately, and had all the skills to build Bitcoin. Adam and I know he did not. But I fed it to a bunch of AI engines and said, build me a story for why this person is Satoshi. Entirely convincing. I said it now, if you don't know the person and you didn't know some nuance and details, you read this and you are 99%. He is a better candidate than anyone has ever proposed. Yet, I would never release that person's name because of what it would do to their family. And I know for a fact that person isn't Satoshi. So I think it just goes to say that there was a broader community than most people realize. We had 20 or 30 people working at our company who were cypherpunk legends at the time, who all were brilliant coders who studied this and looked at it. There were other people that they influenced. There were tons of people in Japan. I knew some of the cypherpunk community in Japan, and those people were very humble, very quiet, but knew all the coding, knew the ethos. I think there's a larger population than most people realize of potential suspects, and I would never contribute to pointing a light at any of them.
That's fair. Austin, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with us this story of zero-knowledge systems, the story of this vision, the challenges, sort of what happened with the company, and then how you went on to get involved in Bitcoin later, Blockstream, and what you're doing now. Thanks so much for sharing all this.
My pleasure, Anna. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm happy to follow up offline and introduce you to a few other people of that era, because I know it provides some nice nostalgia, I think, for us all.
Totally. Thanks so much. And I want to say thank you to the podcast team, Rachel, Henrik, and Tanya, and to our listeners. Thanks for listening.